Hello and welcome back. It's good to be seen by you again. We're going to be engaging in a 7-part series on the 6 questions that they ask you when you die. These 6 questions represent a sort of exit interview that a person would go through after they leave this world, Ad Mea Ve'esrim. And it seems entirely reasonable that these questions and knowing these questions, knowing what you would be asked after you live your life on this earth, would serve to allow you to reverse engineer the life that you ought to live in this world so that when you leave this world, you'll be able to answer those questions in a way that is genuinely satisfying. The subject of these 6 questions is discussed in the Gemara, the Talmud, in the tractate called Shabbat, and it's on page 31a. And the person who suggests this, his name is Rava. Rava is the one who says, these are the 6 questions they ask you when you die. Or more specifically, when you are brought to justice or to judgment. So how does Rava know? There are a couple places in the Talmud in which people have death or near-death experiences and then come back and report on what they saw, but this is not one of them. Rava is actually responding to a verse in Isaiah. There are some verses in the Torah and in the Tanakh which represent not just a localized sense of meaning, but actually represent a universal pattern that a person could see repeated throughout many different instances. An example of this is actually the second verse in the Torah where it says, and the land was tohu, chaos, and vohu, void, and darkness on the face of the depths. And the Spirit of God hovered over the water. So that verse, which is, at least in the simple sense, meant to describe what the world was like before God said, let there be light, is also taken to mean to call attention to a relationship between these different factors: tohu, chaos, and vohu, void, and choshech, and darkness, and water, and Spirit of God, face of the depths. This is a shape which is going to show up in other places. For example, some people say that this represents the different exiles that the Jewish people would go through throughout their history. There are many more like this, where there's a verse which, again, represents not just an instance, but it represents a pattern, and people might draw conclusions from that. Rava draws his conclusions about the 6 questions from this particular verse that we're going to discuss shortly in Isaiah 33. Here I will show you the instance. That's my Facebook. But here is the actual instance of the Gemara. And that Gemara referring to this verse in Isaiah. The verse that we're going to be referring to, Isaiah 33, V'haya emunat itecha, chosen yeshuot, chochmat vadat, yirat Hashem hi otzaro. And this verse is kind of hard to understand. The words mean something like the faith in your times, a storehouse of salvation, wisdom and knowledge. Fear of God is her treasure, or is your treasure. One commentary, the Malbim, on this makes it a lot easier to understand. So if we look here at the Malbim says, you are now going to have Mashem mantem bashem beiti marayim. The fact that you believed in God during the bad times. That's why it says Haya emunati techa. This faith that you had in God during the bad times. V'lo nasog libchem emunato, and your heart did not falter from believing in God. Ze haya lachem chosen. This will become a storehouse for you. This faith that you had or have, this becomes a repository, a resource for you. V'hon chazak shel yeshuot. It becomes a source of wisdom. Of salvation. Shachachmat vadat, and also wisdom and knowledge. This faith that you have or had will become a resource for you. That's what this verse is saying. Shachachmat vadat Hashem herbatchem. You've gained this through having this faith during these difficult times. And it answers also the second part of the verse, Yirat Hashem yotzaro. The fear or awe of God that a person would have also becomes a treasure house or a storehouse. that you can store these things. These wisdoms and knowledges and salvations become something that you can then tap into at a certain point. I want us just to see this verse so we know what it is that we are drawing from here. This verse becomes, again, the verse that different people are going to reflect on and show different meanings because they feel that this verse represents a kind of pattern, a series, an order, a relationship between different factors and objects or experiences that can be learned from and extrapolated into other areas. So the first, Rava is actually the second person in this passage of the Talmud to have a comment on this particular verse in Isaiah. Again, Rava, who suggests that there are 6 questions that they ask you when you die, and he's going to draw his 6 questions from this verse. He's the second person to comment on this verse in this particular passage of the Talmud. The first one is someone named Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is an amazing and interesting character. He has a whole backstory. He was a pirate at some point and became a rabbi. We need more pirate rabbis, I think. So Reish Lakish says, what does it mean? And then he brings the verse. What does it mean, this verse, that the faith that you had during those times is a repository of salvation and wisdom and knowledge? He takes each one of these verses and associates them with a different order of Mishnah. There are 6 orders of Mishnah. There are 6 general categories of Mishnah. A Mishnah, again, being the sort of the first instance of oral Torah, of oral tradition that we have. And he shows that the first word, emunat, the first word of this verse, emunat, that represents Seder Zra'im. That's the order that refers to agricultural law. So within this order, you'll find tractates like how to leave the corner of your field open and how do you tithe and different things like that. That's all covered in the question of emunah, of faith, because agriculture and faith are tied closer together. I believe that it will rain. Itecha, again, I'm just showing you this so you can see that there's a pattern here that will then be reflected by Rava when he talks about the 6 questions. Itecha, your times. The times, that corresponds to Seder Moed, which is the order of Mishnah that includes all the different holidays, Yoma, Sukkah, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkah, Passover, Purim. Chosen, this idea of a repository or of a storehouse. Zeh Seder Nashim, this refers to the order of Mishnah that deals with marriage and divorce. Yeshuot, salvation. Zeh Seder Nizikin, this refers to the order of the Mishnah that's involved with questions of damages, like literally property damages. And a person might look to the courts to offer them salvation because they've been wronged and they're looking to have that be addressed by the law. Chokhmat, this idea of wisdom, that has to do with the order of Mishnah called Kodashim, which revolves around sacrifices and what would happen in the temple. Why that's wisdom is another question for another day. Dat, the last part of this verse, that refers to Taharot. That refers to questions of purity and impurity, or Tuma and Tahara, how a person becomes, in a sense, spiritually defiled by coming in contact with a dead body and how a person recovers from that and is able to re-enter into the encounter with the holy. Those are the 6 main nodes of this verse, this again archetypal verse, that Reish Lakish associates them with the different orders of the Mishnah. And he ends by saying, Yirat Hashem Yotzaro, the end of the verse, which says that really the fear of God underlies them all. That's the storehouse or the treasure house that underlies them all. So that's just one example of how this verse plays out. Then Rava comes along, who's the star of our story for the moment, and he comes along and says, B'shah shemachnisin adam ladin. I'm going to be very specific about the translation here of this section because each word is going to be important, and we will find ourselves looking deeper into some of these words as we continue on in this series. So Rava says, B'shah, at the hour, shemachnisin, that they bring him in, or bring a person in, adam, a person, a human, ladin, to judgment. Umrimlo, they say to him, Nasata v'natata be'emunah. Did you give and take or do business be'emunah, faithfully, or in faith? That's number 1. Kavata itim la Torah. Did you set times for Torah? Asakta b'firdia v'rivya. Were you involved with populating the world or with being fruitful and multiplying? Which doesn't necessarily mean did you have children. There are other ways that people look at this. Sapita lishua, did you anticipate salvation? Pilpalta b'chokhmah, did you have pilpul? Pilpul can mean a hot pepper, but it can also mean a spicy debate or a spicy conversation. Did you have conversations and debates within wisdom? Which might mean, did you debate wisely, or it might mean did you debate about wisdom, or did you wisely choose which debates you want to enter into? Hevanta davar mitoch davar. Did you understand one thing from within another? Did you draw conclusions from what you knew to apply them to new areas of life? Those are the 6 questions that Rava thinks they ask you when you die. Again, based upon this verse from Isaiah, a verse which serves as a sort of archetypal verse. And we know that because this other rabbi, Reish Lakish, also drew a conclusion about the 6 parts of this verse and what they might mean. As we continue on in this series, we will get a chance to wonder about the relationship between this list that Rava produced and the previous list that Reish Lakish produced, and to wonder more about the relationship between these 6 elements. The Gemara goes on, though, or Rava goes on in the Gemara to say, Afilu hachi, still yet, just like Reish Lakish did when he brought these 6 things, then he said, Afilu hachi, and still yet, the last part of the verse, Yirat Hashem hi otzaro, the fear of God is the person's otzar, it is your treasure or your treasure house. So both of them did this thing where they said there's this verse and it has these 6 things, and these 6 things are important for these reasons, but there's another one which is underlying them and holding them together, as it were. And that thing is called Yira. That trait or that attitude or approach is called Yira, or Yirat Hashem specifically. That usually is understood to mean that I'm aware of my relationship to God at all times. And I'm aware that my actions have consequences at all times. And the assumption here is that without this, all those 6 things will be too small. They're not held together. They don't make a life. They don't make a path of spiritual direction. They make independent points. But when we have this Yira, this otzar of Yira, this storehouse of Yira, of awareness of God, that is something that that holds them together. And therefore, he goes on to say, just like he says, if you have this thing called Yira, yes, whatever, we don't know exactly what he's saying yes to, ilo, and if not lo, then you don't have this thing, which we don't know exactly what he's addressing there, but Rava wants us to know that the Yira holds these together. Mashallah Adam Shamar the shlucho. So it's like a parable of a person who said to their messenger, this is not a servant, but a messenger, and I think it's an important detail. Haleli kor chitin la'aliyah. Bring up for me a measure of wheat up to the loft. A core, I think, is the amount of seeds that you would be able to plant in a normal hectare. I think is how they define a core. So it's the way they would measure the volume of seeds that you would buy was how much land you could plant with that amount of seeds. Halach vehelalo. So this messenger went and brought it up for him. Then the person who sent him said, Amarlo, Eravta ali bahen kav chomatin. Did you mix in for me into this wheat that you brought me? Did you mix up with the wheat some of this salty soil? Apparently, the salty soil would operate to preserve the wheat. Amarlo lav. He said, I did not. Amarlo, and he said to him, Mutav im lo ha'eleta. It would have been better if you had not brought it up. This salt soil is meant to represent this yirah, this awareness of God, without which these other things don't really have value. They don't work. So similarly, if you didn't bring up these 6 things that Rava said, these 6 things that they're going to ask you when you die, the big bottom line 7th thing that you have to have underneath them all is this thing called yirah. It is notable, by the way, that he doesn't ask him to bring up the soil with salt. He just assumes that he would know that. And similarly, the Gemara seems to understand that this is not one of the questions that they ask you. It's not something that they're going to ask you because they don't think they have to ask you. Like, you should know this already. You should know that you should have this thing called yirah, and if you don't, then these other things are not going to work. So it's interesting to note. That is the passage in the Gemara. And so now we know, as we live our lives and make our choices, we should be sure that we have paid sufficient attention to these 6 things. Have we done business faithfully? Have we set times for learning Torah? Have we been involved in populating the world or civilizing the world? Have we had wise conversations? Have we learned one thing from within another thing? Have we anticipated salvation? Of course, one of the things you'll notice as you think about this passage is what's missing there. Like most mitzvot, like it doesn't seem like they're going to ask you, like, did you put a mezuzah on your door, um, or did you keep Shabbat? That those are not a part of this questioning, which is really shocking and interesting. Um, we'd have to explore what the relationship is between these questions and the rest of the Torah. And it will also be fruitful to notice as we go along, as I believe I mentioned, the relationship between these 6 things that Rava mentions and the 6 things that Rish Lakish mentioned. Like, how do these 6 orders of Mishnah line up with the 6 questions that a person will be asked? But more importantly than anything else is the very simple functional advice that's being given to a person in this world, that lest we be caught flat-footed when we get to the world to come or get to the world of truth and enter into judgment, we know what's expected of us here. And over the next 6 weeks, we'll study in greater detail how these questions would best be answered and what it means to be involved in these things in a way that will be genuinely satisfying of our own standards and integrity, and also genuinely satisfying of the standards that are being set for us in this world. So looking forward to fruitful exploration with you. Thank you so much for watching this, and looking forward to discussing further.